Hello everybody, my name's Nick Burks. Thank you very much for coming along to this inaugural seminar of our autumn programme. Regulars amongst you will know that every 6 weeks or so we try and have one of these early morning talks along the themes of trends in politics, economics, society, technology, to try and understand the forces that will be shaping and changing the lives of our customers. We're delighted for this opening event of the season to have Dr. Karen Stephenson, who looks at the social life of officers. I was reminded of how powerful this new understanding of how organisations really work by Jonah Lehrer's book, Imagination. I know Jonah Lehrer has been disgraced slightly because he tried to improve on a quote of Bob Dylan's in his book, but he talks about how innovation and creativity rise as the size of cities rise, but that's exactly the opposite in organisations. As they get bigger, they become less creative. He says that instead of imitating the freewheeling city, these businesses minimise the very interactions that lead to new ideas. They erect walls and establish hierarchies. They keep people from relaxing and having insights. They stifle conversations, discourage dissent, and suffocate social networks. Rather than maximising employee creativity, they become obsessed with minor efficiencies. So Karen's going to talk to us about some of that sort of territory and explain what happens and what we can do about it. And I think, Karen, you're going to encourage questions as you go along.
Yes.
So please feel free to interact. Karen.
I'm pleased to be here. You all can hear me all right. Is that very good? Thank you so much for having me here this morning. It's such a pleasure to be in London. You've had quite a banner year, and I'm here on the tail end of it, and it's just lovely. The city is so sparkling. And what I'd like to talk about today are the social networks that not only enliven cities and economic regions, but also the knowledge that grows inside office spaces. So I will be touching upon these other larger, grander ideas as well. But really, I think all social networks begin at home and also in the office. So that's where we should look. And if as I talk about some of these concepts, if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand. And here's why. Because I'm building on these concepts. And if there's something that you don't understand, it's better to get it off your chest now, because somebody else will have a question like you, and that way we can answer the question for everyone. Okay. So, I'm going to be talking about office networks. Now, these go on all the time. We understand that they go on all the time. We participate in them, but what we don't see are these kinds of structures. These are the networks that are actually static, that exist. This is an innovation network. The blue lines that are there are the shared relationships in an innovative network. And by properly diagnosing it, we can take a look at the office to determine that the office space has become a barrier. Space can become a barrier, but also organizational structures can become a barrier, and people can become a barrier to it. So the goal is, how can we enliven and encourage innovation inside office spaces and create a better sense of community? This is an image on LinkedIn of someone's professional community, and it goes across many office spaces. You can see it's a galaxy of connection. It's a Milky Way. This is how everyone is brought together. And all the little tiny dots are there that represent people's networks and connections to each other, so much so that when you scale back and look at it, it looks as though you were looking up at the heavens. But really what this is people participating in their shared relationships and their egocentric networks being aggregated. So what do I mean by an egocentric network? Well, we all have one, and it looks like this. I'd like you to meet Bart. Bart is in the center of that network. He's a student of mine, but it could be you, it could be me, it could Karen Stephenson in that center. And what he's done on LinkedIn, and what we all can do, is that he has placed people that he works with, his student groups, his work groups, his community, and his family. And he's given them different colors, and they have different identifications which have been removed from this image. And he's drawn lines to them because that is who he trusts or who he goes to for particular types of queries. And as you can see on some of them, you'll see that there is some connection across the groups, but minimal. And that's because, according to Bart, he's at the center of his universe. And I'm at the center of mine. And you're at the center of yours. And when we interact in the office space or in communities or in our families, that's how we perceive the world, through an egocentric network. We can't help but do it that way. The interesting thing is about the egocentric network, though, is that it drives our perceptions and it influences the decisions that we make. And the decisions that we make based on the egocentric network do not at all correspond to what's really going on, which is this galaxy, this Milky Way of interconnection. So this begs the issue of why we need to actually monitor or measure social networks as a form of social capital. Because if we're making decisions on our egocentric network, we're doomed to fail, because we need to look at the larger network that we're embedded in. This larger network, which exists on LinkedIn and also exists inside the organization, is really what makes up our culture. So I'm going back and forth to show you the dramatic difference between these two images. We live and breathe by the egocentric network, but we're living and breathing within a tsunami of connections on LinkedIn or in our communities. So what does that mean when it comes to the office? Well, these interconnections are enabled because we are with each other. We have candid conversations. We talk over coffee around the water cooler or in the elevator. Sometimes we're doing it on Twitter, on email, because we might be hoteling or working remotely, like the freelancer or and I just put the freelancer up there, but it could be anybody that's working from home. So we have something that we're looking at here in terms of a distinction and a contradiction between 18th and 19th century offices and also the freeing up and the mobilization of both people and information, which allows people to move in and out of a traditional office space. So I call the traditional office space the 800-pound gorilla. No disrespect, it just is, because we're taking hundreds of years with us of the 18th and 19th century into the 21st century because of the traditional office. The reason that traditional office existed the way it did, though, is because information wasn't mobilized, and people were tethered to the technology and to the machine where the information stayed and was stored, and then people exchanged with that machine or with each other, and that's the way information moved. But now information, because of the advances in technology, is free. It's untethered, and people became untethered as well. So information moves in a technology that travels with you, and you move through waves and waves of information as you walk down the street, and people can also move. So it's really beginning to crack open the last 100 to 200 years of the way we think about offices and the way that we can communicate. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how these networks form inside the office. And to do that, I'm going to come back to something that's very ancient called tribes. And I'm going to use this by metaphor. I'm going to talk about a very organic, primordial form of a network called a section of the nuclear family. It's really all about you at the top, your spouse, and your mother-in-law. This is a little tiny triangle. Now, the reason why I'm going to the family is because it illustrates my point, and it just becomes compounded in the office. Let me explain. That's you at the top, and you're very happy, and you absolutely adore your spouse, your significant other, boyfriend, girlfriend, whoever, on this side. You love them. And they, now this may not be true in all cases, but they love their mother. And the mother appreciates and loves you just as long as you treat that offspring in the manner to which she expects. And so you have a very lovely triangle of 3 relationships, all positively signed. This is called a signed network. Now, I'm sure that this never happens to anyone in this room, but occasionally people do disagree with their spouse. And when that happens, their relationship changes. And so you have to work it out, compromise, you have to sit down and talk to each other. But before you even have a chance to do that, faster than the speed of light or a New York minute, is the spouse is communicating immediately to his or her mother, who then puts pressure on you saying, what have you done? Why aren't you appropriately treating my child in the manner to which he or she should be treated? And so all of a sudden you've gone from a positively signed trifecta of relationships to one where you're under pressure and have 2 negative relationships coming at you. This happens all the time in office politics, but the reason I talk about in terms of family is because we all come from one. Now, the interesting thing about this is that we always have direct connection with people that we like to work with or we want to talk to. I will go to you to have a conversation. That is a direct connection. And so if you'll take a look at that unhappy face up there, which could be you are now in an unhappy relationship or one that's filled with tension between your mother-in-law and your spouse as you try to work things through. Because the one relationship over which you have no direct control is their relationship with each other. It's called an indirect link. And the way we think about it inside the office or inside communities is like this. It's a mathematical axiom. A friend of a friend is a friend. That's an indirect link of one. A friend of a friend is a friend. An enemy of a friend is an enemy. That's an indirect link of one. And that indirect link over which you have no direct control but only influence, is where all politics begins. That's it. Pages 90 to 121, The Prince by Niccolò Machiavelli. We're still arguing about him. 500 years. The indirect link. Now, that's just one indirect link. When you go into the office, when you go to your family occasions, you walk through hundreds and thousands of indirect links in the same way that you walk through all those tweets and the emails and all the information that's coursing in space. You walk through all of those indirect links and you can't track them. No human being can track them. You're not omniscient, so give it up. The only thing that a human being can really track is simply one indirect link, and we can barely control this. We can barely keep our hands on this one. So, it's a gargantuan challenge. How do we take a look at these networks in such a way that we can understand what is happening here and improve upon it? Because it's not that we're going to go through life and not ever have disagreements in our families or in our offices, but we need to understand the impact that these tiny little networks have on our larger cultural networks inside the office and inside our organizations. So what I'd like to do today is talk about 3 concepts around these networks, 3 principles of networks. First, I have to use my glasses here. The term network is a noun. Most people talk about networking as a verb, and I appreciate that. I love to network more than anybody else. Go to a party, have a chat over coffee, that's great. But network is a noun. It's a hard structure, and it's very durable. In fact, at any one point in time, a network is more powerful than our organizational charts or hierarchies at any one point in time. Over time, the hierarchy is more powerful and can squash a network. That's just a little dynamic there. But I'm going to be talking about network as a noun. So I'm not talking about the behaviors. I'm going to talk about the residue of the behaviors that it leaves behind, the wake of people forming trust inside the office. Networks are formed simply because they find and burrow down into the inefficiencies of hierarchical structure. So what we take is sometimes an imposition of, in terms of how rude that a network would form as a result of this flaw in our policy is actually a very natural phenomenon. That's what networks do. They look for the holes in the gap and the gaps and things like that, and they try to bridge across it. That's what networks are famous for. And that can result in efficiencies, but it can also result in, well, let's think about the toxic CDOs that's virally spread, like the AIDS epidemic, across multiple institutions that went from New York all the way through the banks of Europe. That's what a network does. So these networks are very powerful in the goodness that they bring, but they can, if not properly monitored and understood, can also bring us down in ways we don't anticipate. So the point is that there's a symbiotic relationship. One cannot exist without the other. You cannot have a network and not have a hierarchy nearby that's pulsing at it. You cannot have a hierarchy and not have a network. They exist together. And in fact, like a solid and a liquid in science, they really are on a continuum. But I'm going to talk about them as though they're discrete entities for the purposes of illustration, just in the same way that any scientist would talk about a liquid and a gas. The second concept I want to talk about is that networks contain different types of knowledge. When we form relationships with each other, I might go to you for a new idea. I want to bounce a new idea off of you, but I also need your signature on this requisition, or I've got to go talk to somebody about who's an expert in the area of tax law, but I also have to work with him on something else. So we have pluralities of knowledge that exist in our relationships with each other. Now, with the proper methods, which I really won't have time to go through here today, you can mine for these specific types of knowledge. So even though you might be going to people for a person for multiple things or going to different people for different types of knowledge, the whole point of it is it creates these network structures. And the only way that you can really understand them well is to do a proper scan. In the same way that you do a proper scan when you go in once a year, and I hope you do, for your physical. You have to take your body in, you have to get a scan. It's called an X-ray or an MRI. It layers everything out. Doctor carefully looks it over, the radiologist looks it over to see if there's anything amiss. And in the same type of way, our organizations have a corporal body. We have to monitor that health. We look at that health by doing a scan, and we can do it once a year or once every 2 years. So knowledge is stored inside these networks. It's called tacit knowledge. It's not written down in a process or a procedure or a policy. It's shared understandings. And there's research that says approximately 80% of all organizational knowledge is tacit. Well, isn't that something? We're not measuring the network, so therefore we're missing 80% of the knowledge, and we just assume that it's going to be communicated efficiently through all of us in the office space. I don't think so. So this is what gets me worked up. How can we assume? That is what I call taking a huge leap of faith. I argue for we need to measure these things, and we need to do it routinely in the same way that we take care of ourselves once a year when we go get our physical. Our organizations the culture of them needs care, and we just can't assume that it will take care of itself. We need to look after it. So that's the second concept I'd like to talk about. And then finally, the third concept is that networks are comprised of these nodes and these links, these images that you saw, which can be mathematically measured and characterized. Now, lucky for you, I'm not going to be doing any formula, although I know everyone in this room will be completely comfortable were I to put a formula up. But I don't want to see your eyes roll back because I know you see enough of them. But the point is that you can measure these networks. Now that's the diagnosis. Well, how do we measure them? Well, we're not all connected equally. We have different types of relationships. We might be created equally under some constitutional law, but we're certainly not connected equally. So we need to measure that. We need to try to understand. Unequal connection is non-random. But is it non-random because of science? Is there a science underlying it? And this is the thing that took 40 years to get me to where I'm talking to you today for 40 minutes. 40 years of research, and not just from my end, but I stand on the shoulders of giants, have been looking and looking and looking at these networks to try to understand the underlying rules of behavior, the algorithms that undergird human connection. And guess what? We're no exception to nature or culture. Scientists, engineers, we see these mathematical algorithms in nature and in culture. So the good news is that it's not random, it's non-random, and it gives up its secrets to the laws of science. So that's helpful to know. When we measure these networks, we know that we can actually determine key areas of connection. Now, if you know that, if it gives up its secrets to the laws of science, that means that it's accessible to understanding. And if you can understand it, then you can manage it. And you can change the way you're connected. Yes, there's a hand.
Just ask, are networks successful because they're voluntary, or can you enforce them?
You can enforce the network through transactional behavior. You must go to this person to get this requisition, but that's almost is where the network shifts almost into authority and hierarchy. The trusted networks that I'm talking about, you cannot legislate trust. You can provide an environment in which it's healthy for trust to grow, but you cannot legislate the way trust grows. The only way that you can absolutely guarantee that you will have a trusted relationship generally is to have life-threatening situations, which I do not recommend as a management intervention because the lawsuits would be gargantuan and the impact of that. So life-threatening situations will do it. Cocktail parties certainly will do it. Informality will do it, where people can come together and converse. But generally, trust grows incrementally, not immediately, unless, of course, it's a natural disaster or a man-made disaster. There were many powerful trust relationships that were formed on 9/11, which we just passed an anniversary on, in New York, that have persisted and will persist throughout the end, as will happen in any kind of emergency situation. So did I answer your question? Thank you. So these are the three concepts that we'll be talking about. To begin with the first one, here is an example from my database of an organization's hierarchy, which is beautifully stylized, but it has the essential components of an organizational chart. It's elegant, it's a structure of beauty. I actually love hierarchy, and I know that sounds heretical, but hierarchies, we can't live without them. They are efficient, and they try to minimize risk, and we need to appreciate them for what they do. That is their core competency. But when there's risk or uncertainty or ambiguity in the environment, which there always is, it's brought in from the outside, it wells up from within with how people are trying to work with each other, then that risk or uncertainty is mediated by human networks, which is on the right-hand side. So the network on the right-hand side consists of the same people, those little black nodes are people, and those people occupy and populate this hierarchy. So this is a one-to-one mapping, and as you can see, these two structures look very different. The work network is on the right, and the hierarchy is on the left. Now you can also see that in the work network, there are some colored nodes, which I will address momentarily, but let me just briefly refer to them here. In any type of network structure, mathematically, there are key connectors, and sometimes they're actually called cut points in graph theory. And the idea behind that is that if you were to expunge the network of the key connectors, which would be the red, the yellow, and the green, and I'll talk about their differentiation later. If you were to expunge the network of those people, then the network would disaggregate and you could effectively destroy the culture, which is what terrorist networks can do and what governments try to do to terrorist networks. But I can't talk about that because I have to kill you all. So I'm not going to talk about that part of my work. But that's actually what people are looking for. They're looking for the key connections inside a network because you can't take out whole networks. It's impossible. So you try to go after the key contexts. Now, the key contexts in positive networks, such as in our office spaces, these are the folks that have, through past experiences, random events, have garnered the trust in such a way that they are sought after for their opinion or for different types of knowledge. Now, the yellow node that you would see, obviously you can see that right away because it has the highest incidence. But the green node has lesser, it's not about quantity, and certainly the red nodes, as you can see, don't have very many connections at all. And those are tapping into different forms of mathematical measurement, which I'll come to later. The interesting thing is, though, that those key connectors, the red, the yellow, and the green, are not the director or the CEO. And so what I'm often advising folks inside the hierarchy is to get over it and to recognize that their role is to embrace the hierarchy and understand that's where they are, but that they may be less connected by virtue of the fact that they are in the hierarchy in a senior leadership position, and to be able to appreciate and look for support within the network. These are the yin and the yang. Now, what happens in the model is that if you were to try to approximate reality, then these two things actually come together into some beautiful molecule of interaction, and which I call the magic of culture, which is where they come together, and then that's what we live in every day. So I've tried to animate it as best I can here. So, concept number one, hierarchy and network are yin and yang. They are two structures that exist in a dynamic interaction. Hierarchies consist of authority. You will do this. That's okay. I can be offended at it, but why be offended? That's what hierarchies do. They have coercion. Coercion is part of their structure. They build in authority and policy and rules and procedure, and they establish themselves, and their goal in hierarchies is to minimize risk. They're very slow to change, which is why I have all this white here, because I used to pound my head against the wall of universities trying to get them to change and to look at this and that, but then I realized, wait a minute, this is the hierarchy. They're doing exactly what they should be doing. They are stable. That's all right. Now, you can be stable and be out of step. That's another thing. So we have to take a look at that. But hierarchies change slow, they change in little tiny baby steps, and it takes them a long time to do it. Networks are very different. Networks are informal, they're flexible, they're predicated upon trust. Now, there are a lot of people that write about trust. I can certainly talk about research on trust, but I do not begin to understand or appreciate for one moment what the complexities that go into trust. And were I ever to try to understand that, hopefully I might win the Nobel Peace Prize, but I'm not holding my breath. So I'm not really understanding what goes into trust, but as a radiologist, as your doctor, I'm looking at the tracks, the traces of what trust leaves. And if I can track the trust or its traces, then I'm actually looking at the structure of culture, because it's through those trust relationships that all that knowledge courses. So in the same way that you're looking at a large macromolecule and it's enveloped with the electromagnetic bonds of all the different atoms that form a large molecule, you're looking at a culture of people that are enveloped in a wave of energy really called trust. Now, I won't have time to talk about all the aspects of this chart. I certainly can share it with you, but one thing I did want to bring up is that the only fundamental way to really break a network is through betrayal. So I was going to ask in this room, has anyone not been betrayed or betrayed others? And I see no one raising their hands. Excellent. Because I was going to say, if anyone raised their hands, I was going to have to take you out back after the talk and talk to you about delusional behavior. So we all know about betrayal, and betrayal is not a misunderstanding, it's a fundamental break. And if there is betrayal, you cannot bring it back in the workplace. You must work around it through hierarchical structures. Do not waste a nanosecond on trying to bring back a betrayed relationship. And I have had many folks say to me, Dr. Stephenson, that's very cold. And can't you forgive people? I say, you can forgive them all you want, but in the workplace, a betrayed relationship will never be reconstituted. That's not to say I'm not Dr. Phil. I'm Dr. Karen. Dr. Phil would say, but in the family, you can forgive people. That may very well be. and back in the family relationship. That's entirely up to each one of you as individuals. But in the workplace, if there's betrayal, you need to use your hierarchy to build a bilateral structure. This is not complicated. So you kind of go back and forth between these structures. If you're in the throes of change, you're going to be relying more on your network. If you're in a period of stability where you've harvested the innovation, then you're going to be building up and reshaping your hierarchy. So these are, like I said, the yin and the yang. Concept number 2, there's different kinds of knowledge. So let me talk about that for just a moment. If you have all of these different networks, they can be in one amorphous system of connection in the same way that we have this amazing body of ours and it's organized various ways, but when we perceive it, we're all together. We don't really see it through all these layers that you would see in an MRI. That being said, you can produce a scan of a body in layers with an MRI. And in the same way, you can look at networks and mine the areas of knowledge. I just want to mention on this ladder that there's an implied hierarchy, if you will, of trust. At the bottom levels of work and social interaction, these require low levels of interchange and reciprocity, low levels of trust. Trust is important, but they're generally low levels. But when it comes to who do I talk to about a new idea, who do I go to for expert knowledge, who do I go to really help me change things, then that's really requiring a deeper level of trust, because I won't just talk to anybody about those ideas. I'll only talk to people I really trust. So even though we're not necessarily aware of who we go to and why, we're making these subtle calculations, like in Malcolm Gladwell's idea of blink. We're making these subtle calculations that are at the subconscious level of who we go to for different types of knowledge. And there's a valence there, there's an electromagnetic valence of trust, because we're going to them for certain types of knowledge. So who I go to for career advice, let me tell you, I'm not just going to talk to anybody about that. The real advice, I'm going to sit down quietly, perhaps even out of the workplace, and talk to a colleague of mine. So there are different levels of knowledge, there's different types of knowledge, and with that associated levels of trust. And finally, concept number 3, there are key connectors or tipping points. This is the smallest molecule, if you will, that you can draw. I call it my apostolic molecule because there's 12 in there. And that where you get the mathematical distinction between all 3 types of these connections in graph theory, which are called centrality. But not to belabor the point, the yellow node is what we call the hub, which are typically the life of the party, and they maintain many connections with a lot of people, so they have high incidence rates, they're able to keep attention and hold your attention and hold the trust. So they're major multitaskers, excellent communicators, and it goes both ways. Now, I'm describing human behavior, and you might think I'm describing personality, but I'm not. Personality is a part of it, but it's not. It's an aspect of it, but it doesn't determine if you're a hub or a gatekeeper or pulse taker. Because remember, don't be fooled by your egocentric network. You're in the tsunami of interconnections, which is helping shape who you are and how you get trusted and how you trust others. So the hubs are very interesting, and you can have a cocktail party and put them in the middle of the room and watch them connect. However, because they're excellent communicators, if you have a really closely held secret, I'd be careful about telling a hub, because they'll just blurt it out. And there's no malfeasance with hubs, not at all. They just love to connect and communicate, and they can't censor themselves. Which is why we like them, because they get the message out, but you have to be careful what you say to them. Gatekeepers, on the other hand, find themselves on critical pathways. So they're very careful about how information moves through them. They can speed it up, they can slow it down. They can make information disappear, or they can disappear the people that give that information. They can color information with the patina of their personal bias, and so fundamentally change the nature of the information that's passing through them. So gatekeepers are very strategic. They tend to know that they are strategic because they're not connected to so many people, so they become more self-aware. And so one must make sure that you have proper allies with the gatekeepers. Now, all of us have yellow, green, and red in every single one of us because when you're mathematically connected in a network, you have all components. But I'm talking about the people that rise up in a population of 500 or 5,000 who are larger than life in terms of being connected. And finally, the most subtle of the three components is the pulse taker, having your fingers on the pulse of the organization. The pulse taker is like a Machiavelli in the sense that they're below the radar, unseen, unheard, and they usually only emerge during trauma or an emergency, because that's when the subtle, the tacit knowledge that you might carry in your mind about different people suddenly comes through into consciousness and say, geez, I got to go talk to Judy about that. What would she do in this situation? And so there's subtle shepherds, if you will, of the culture. And empirically, it's been determined that it takes only really about 5% of a population, whatever that number is. If you can find the top 5% of the connectors, you can produce sustainable, permanent, shifting, where the culture really shifts, change. Most cultural change is called drift, cultural drift. It moves at the speed of molasses in the dead of winter, finally moves to a certain state, and then it kind of slowly comes back after about a year or two. But if you find out who these folks are, you can, and they are your ambassadors of change, if you will, then they actually, because they're so trusted, they'll actually produce the fundamental change, and you'll stay shifted, your culture will stay changed, and it won't drift back. So we've been through the three concepts. Networks versus hierarchies, there's different layers of knowledge inside networks, and within every network, there are these key connectors. So now what I thought I would do is just simply show you a tiny little organization to show you the power of the networks. Now this organization has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 little boxes, so ordinarily in a hierarchy they would all be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and scaled down like that. But since we already know and are very familiar with hierarchies, I've dispensed with that slide, and I'm moving immediately to show you the work network. And as you'll see, the work network is captured by the red lines, which are self-reporting. People say who I work with, and they answer back. So what you're seeing are two-way ties. In other words, anytime you see a line up there, it's a two-way tie. You can look at one-way ties, that's fine, but one-way ties are more about perception. And for the 40 minutes that we have here, I'm going to be talking about behavior on the ground. So if I say I work with you and you say you work with me, there's a good chance we work together. And we're filling out a survey privately. So, we're not necessarily conferring with each other. So likely, in all likelihood, that means we're really working together. Now, the thicker lines show a higher frequency. So you can't just tick the box. What you have to do is you have to say, well, geez, do I work with Judy daily, weekly, monthly, biannually, annually? So you can set frequency weights, which operate as weights in the analysis and calculation. So what you're seeing here is the CEO. When you show a hierarchy like this, you're seeing a CEO in the middle, radiated out by the managers, and then the managers have professionals connected to them. So, and the squares and the circles represent males and females. So the squares are men, I apologize, men, and the circles are women. I have not changed this over to the international symbols. This is an old teaching case, but it's a real case. It really happened, and I'm going to tell you exactly what happened when I saw it, which is why I use this case. You'll notice that there's node number 8 up there. See where all the red lines come to? That's Diane. And when the CEO saw this, he said, I had no idea Diane was so centrally connected. Now, what do all these different boxes mean? Well, this is a company, it's a financial services firm that does annuities. They have shared customers and shared work. They really don't even need 5 divisions because, honestly, 5 divisions was a legacy effect from organizations past because, of course, people never really update their hierarchies, and this organization was no different. But be that as it may, let's accept the fact that they've got 5 organizational divisions. They're tiny. And there's something about Diane. What is it about Diane? Well, Diane was an amazing integrator, had a lot of expertise, and people trusted Diane, and so they would go to her to try to get everything organized. And that emerges. This is a naturally occurring thing that happens in the workplace. The interesting thing about Diane, though, is when we saw this, we went to interview her, and she said, "You know, I love my work. I just can't wait to get up and get to work, but I'm a little tired." Because when you have tacit knowledge and it's being exchanged through interpersonal relationships, that takes time. So she's looking at long days. Long days. And it's effort and leverage on her because it's through her not manipulation, but her management of those relationships. So there's Diane. Then you'll see node number 5, which is directly connected to the CEO, but you'll notice that there's a gap between node number 5 and his subordinate, node number 6. That's odd. Usually in a hierarchy, you'd expect to see a connection, but sometimes people don't disagree, or they don't agree, and so sometimes you see gaps like that. And you can look around and see other types of connection, lack of connection. You might wonder why it is. But in the same way that you read a book from chapter to chapter, page to page, you read a culture from network to network. So this is the first network, and it's the work network, and remember, work is kind of low on the ladder of trust. So let's go up a little bit and let's look at the social network. Wow, look how different that is. So let me go back so you can compare and contrast. Work network, social network. Really different, isn't it? Well, what happened to Diane? I know. I got a theory. She spends 10 to 12-hour days at the workplace. She wants to go home. She wants to open a bottle of wine, take off her shoes, and watch the fifth season of Being Human. And she doesn't want to have to deal with anything else. All right, because that's where she's going to spend her time, because she's exhausted. So there she is, and it turns out that what you're looking at when you see a highly connected work network with less so on the social network, you are actually looking at a potential problem which you can head off called work burnout, which people do have. You'll also notice that there's a strong tie, again, with number 5 and the director. And this is a golfing relationship, and there's no crime against golf. They like it, they enjoy the sport, let them enjoy it. The one between 11 and 12, between the two women, is one of tennis. And yay, go Murray, won. So let's see, what else? Look again, number 5 and his subordinate number 6 still not connected. Now, when you see the recurring incidents of that, you know you've got a diagnosis. Something's going on in that relationship, and you see again the same thing going on between 5 and 16, that it's a strong relationship. Something's going on there. We don't know what. If you look at a third network, which is the deepest trust network of all, it's the career advice network, and this is such a tiny little network, tiny little organization, you're not going to see a big network here. And the reason is people go outside the workplace to ask about that. But of the networks that you do see here, you see a recurring pattern again. You are seeing 5 and number 16. You're seeing that manager number 16, because I can tell you where they are. After they've played their round of golf, they're 18-holer. They're in the 19th hole with a little bit of scotch and a few cigars, and they're talking about the strategy and maybe getting career advice on what do you think I can do, which is totally normal. Totally normal. But what ends up happening is that the CEO doesn't recognize that other people are observing that. Either not necessarily the 19th hole, not necessarily cigars and scotch, but they're observing the absence. So now let me tell you what happened in this organization. This organization became, because it was highly successful, and they actually wanted their networks analyzed because they had won all kinds of awards. So I was analyzing the networks and reviewing some of the findings with the executive, number 16. It became the target for a hostile takeover because back in the day, hostile takeovers were the wave of the future. And so 16 was removed actually from his leadership position and placed on another board. So in the panic, in a moment of desperation, when somebody is being removed and the platform that you're standing on suddenly blows up, where do you go to? You go to who you trust. So who does he trust? Trust number 5. He says, Stan, take over for me. Stan said, sure, no problem. I understand about the strategy, not an issue. So Stan steps in. But Stan, as you can see, doesn't really understand broadly about what's going on with the day-to-day work. Not unusual, but he wants to put on a good face. So he's walking around talking to everybody about what it is and how they get their job done, whatnot. And everybody basically refers him to Diane. Oh, you got to go talk to Diane. She knows how to do that. Yeah, that's something. Diane figured that out 6 months ago. Go check with her. She knows all the detail. So now Stan starts to go to Diane. So instead of that little thin line that you see connecting Stan to Diane, suddenly it gets thicker and thicker and thicker because he's going to her all the time, talking to her about how she gets her job done. But Diane's already near burnout. So now all of a sudden she's having to respond more to an executive's queries into her work. And did I just mention that she just got passed over for a promotion? So what happens is that Diane says, I think I've had enough, because she's facing burnout. So she says, I will vote with my feet, and walks out the organization, leaving Stan holding his 9-iron, wondering what to do. So he does a couple of big project initiatives, which unfortunately, because he has less of an understanding about the way work is done, fail in a public way. And so he's removed by the board. And the board ends up soliciting everybody in the organization, saying, who do you trust? Who could be our acting director while we try to find somebody appropriate? And everybody, without a doubt, points to number 10, who's weakly connected to everybody, but broadly connected to the most people. Number 10 is a pulse taker. They're invisible. You don't see them until you have an emergency. And then all of a sudden, they come to mind. So, let me now show you, let me move on to another example, because this is such a funny network. I'm only going to now show you 3 examples from 3 different organizations, and only show you one network because they tell the story. This is a social network of a Head Start organization. It's an educational organization in the United States. The men are there, the women are there. Clearly, there is men are in the minority when it comes to gender in terms of hiring, because in Head Start organizations, it's usually K through 12, and it's largely women in this organization that were running it. You see all of those isolated nodes over there to the right? Those Head Start received a bunch of federal funding, and so they were on this huge expansion program, and so they quickly hired about a 30% increase in their population. This is for the entire state of California here that you're seeing. And when they hired these people, they said, get to work, here's your manuals and whatnot, and let's get going. But this map was, this is a map of the social network, and as you can see, the new hires are not very well connected. But this map was taking over a year after they were hired. So you can't just hire people in, you gotta shepherd their assimilation into the culture, because they're still isolated on the social network. Now, yes, of course they worked with people, but they weren't really connected. So, lesson learned there. You'll notice that there's a circle of women right up there at the top that exist as a club, a gatekeeper club, if you will, monitoring the information as it goes from the bulk of the women in the organization over to the men. For a moment there, I thought I was looking at the oldest profession in the world, not the second oldest, which is education. I didn't know what was going on. So I asked the director, who was over here in another part of the organization, and I said, who are these women? I said, they're from different offices, they have different degrees, they have different disciplines, they have different roles inside the organization. I don't get it. She said, well, read out those names to me. So we went around. She said, well, look at their club memberships and family, PTA, and all that kind of stuff. We were trying to figure out what makes these people cluster like that. I came up empty-handed. I was embarrassed. I called her back. I said, I can't find anything. There's no correlation. So she said, well, let's talk about those names again. So we started going around, and we went halfway around the circle, and she says, oh, my gosh. She leans back in her chair, and she says, I know what this is. This is a smoker's circle. And I said, you got to be kidding me. Because the laws at the time in California forced you to smoke outside the building, and it was before they told you to smoke so many feet away. So people would just hang out there in a smoker's clutch and smoke and chit-chat and have a nice little, no different than the water cooler and the coffee machine. Now, I wondered, well, And I went out and looked, and sure enough, that's who they were. They were women that were smoking. But then I thought, well, what about these guys? Because they were hanging out. Do you know that not a one of those men smoked? They just saw that that was a good place to hang out because they figured they could get the information. And why? Because men were in the minority. The glass ceiling was a gender-based glass ceiling where men were in the minority. And for them to break through, they had to get access to information in unusual ways, just like if the case were reversed. So a smoker's circle may seem harmless, but it is harmless, but it also is a conduit for moving information through politically inside an organization. So beware. This is an example of Shell. Shell monitored how people were assimilated into their culture because they were, I can just give it to you in a synopsis. Their large organization was comprised of Dutch engineers. They had a hiring freeze, and then later on they were expanding, and they were hiring young engineers from many cultures all around the world. So you had a bifurcation of the culture by nationality and national culture and by generations. So what was happening is that they found as they were hiring all these young engineers that they would slowly assimilate them into the culture, and after about 4 years they would start to leave. So you spend all that money hiring these people, going through the screening process, nurturing them, growing them, giving them training, and they're gone after 4 years. That is a desperate number that Shell didn't want to even admit to. So what they did is they said, we need to keep these people for good, and you can't chain people to the desk. So the way they did this is that they do annual scans. They find out who the hubs, gatekeepers, and post takers are, and they anoint and appoint them to be the shepherds or the mentors to the new hires that come in. And they reduced their retention, they reduced their attrition, and reduced their time to assimilation from 4 years to 6 months. And now they do this regularly, which, by the way, is very, you can calculate that in terms of a return on investment. So that's how Shell uses this. This is just a quick little chart of other applications, which I thought you would be interested on how people look at their office, the networks in their office. And so finally, what I'm going to do now is just end on this concept. We've been talking so far this morning about the lower half, where you get 3 or more people together inside a network. Those are individuals. But what happens when you're partnering? What happens when government agencies have to work with other government agencies? You work through people. But what happens is that people often hold back because my agency's resources can't be shared with yours. And then it becomes this kind of pecking order of privilege, and where people become isolated in their own tribe. I completely understand that, and that's what happens, and that's why institutional collaboration amongst agencies in government or amongst educational institutions or in healthcare are fraught with difficulty, because it's a complex network of institutions, not people, and that's called a hierarchy. And I believe that hierarchy, the concept of hierarchy, with us, all of us working together, continental Europe working together, trying to bring the different, the fiscal policy together in such a way that we can collaborate and build a sustainable system of governance, is a 21st century challenge. This hierarchy is an image that I developed with a colleague of mine here in the room that was shared with the government, with the Office of the Deputy Prime Minister, for the work that we were doing at the time with public-private partnerships. Jeremy Hawkins, would you please stand and wave to everyone, because he's a government servant and he's responsible for this work. We did this, we worked together for 10 years, labored in the fields of public-private partnerships. And the fruit of our labors was that this was accepted as an accurate form of measurement for improving public-private partnerships, because the only way you can get all these 5 different institutions to interact is to design a network. Here are the areas that were covered. Here's an example of the map. You can see that little tight little group of blue connections? That's the police department and the way that they're connected to the elected councilmen, the officials in the community in this public-private partnership. You see these names that are out here, the call-outs? These are people that were found to be extremely connected as pulse takers, but nobody ever recognized them. And by us recognizing them, they were actually brought into the committees, and they changed the dynamic of how the public-private partnership worked. Yeah.
And then does a new informal network emerge once you put people who were an informal network into the hierarchy or the heterarchy?
Right,
Something else emerges.
You're seeding other networks as a result of that. But that's goodness, because you're creating redundancies, and you need redundancies in terms of relationships and other circuitous ways in which information can be shared. Our issue is not sharing too much information. Our issue is not getting the information shared. So, the 21st century challenge, in my view, is that we've moved from this elegant structure called hierarchy, for which we will never abandon, because we always need hierarchies. We are in a much better way understanding of the nature of a network structure inside our organizations and our offices. But for those of us who live in the office and then we step outside the office in our buildings and we walk out into a public square, it's extremely important that we have public-private partnerships and other kinds of hierarchies, which are education, which are healthcare, which are government agencies, be able to work together constructively. I can't tell you how many times I've seen situations where they could work together and they didn't. In fact, I'd like to share that with you right now. These are just some articles. Let me just go to the next slide and I'll end on this slide. This is a magnificent bureaucracy. It's like a bureaucracy is a thing of beauty. It's a coral reef built upon dead cells of abandoned processes and procedures. And it produces great barrier reefs, which we can go scuba diving and be in awe of. But when it comes to the affairs of human beings, it can bring things to a close. So what you're looking at here are 7 or 8 different divisions, the perimeter of which is made up of little tiny dots that represent people. So there's about 700 in that one over there. And this is showing the relative density of how they communicate when it comes to work. So within the tribe, within the division, it looks like solid blue, but it's made up of thousands and thousands of little blue lines of people responding. And the red lines are colored red differently because they're showing you that it's between divisions. Okay, so it's all about work, but clearly all the work goes on inside the divisions. Now, this study was completed on August 20th of 2001 and is an image of the United States Pentagon. And on September 11, this is what happened. Now, we find out that when I go back to this image, at the time, the government asked for my image back. They said, we need your x-ray. I said, okay, here you go. And they said, we need you to do a forensic analysis and find out what happened. I said, great, I'll do that. He said, and we're going to allow you to do that, but we're going to remove the names of the deceased, because in the prior image before this one, there were people who died in that event on 9/11. So I did the forensic analysis, and sure enough, we found exactly where, because of the competition between these divisions, because of the tribalism, because of the unwillingness to really collaborate, we found where a little piece of paper didn't get to the right place at the right time. So the government gave me the image back after the names were removed and said, Dr. Stephenson, if you can share this with other governments and other organizations so that they can avoid the mistakes that we did, because we learned, but we learned too late and at the cost of too many people. So that image that you saw is a little bit of history. But that was 2001. This is 2005. Do we learn? Do we ever learn? This is New Orleans in Katrina, where you had all these different government agencies coming together, people languished in the face of an impending hurricane coming down, and unfortunately, a lot of people died needlessly, just not because they died because of the hurricane. They died because of different agencies not collaborating and causing confusion and whatnot, and then there were these needless deaths. You know, there's all kinds of good reasons to perish. Running into a building, a burning building, saving somebody, running out into the street, pulling a child out, maybe at the cost of your life. Those are all noble reasons to die. But when people die because of these institutional inefficiencies, because they can't understand their networks well enough to be able to manage their way out of a paper bag, then that is criminal. That was 2005, but no, we can't stop there. 2010. Hello. Your country, my country, the Dutch, we were all together on this one in the Gulf. This is the big oil spill. Again, an example of a hierarchy, getting institutions to work together. We just assume people will do it. You know what they say about the word assume. So I'll close on my comments there, and thank you very much for your time and attention.